ワールドデコーダー始まります。今日のテーマはですね、トランプ 2.0 と世界経済秩序です。特にアメリカ側、海外の視点を大事にしたいと思います。そのためブルームバーグのですね、シンガポールに拠点がありますシニアエディターのデレク・ウォールバンクさんとつないでですね、話を聞いてみたいと思います。デレクさんはですね、本当にこのアメリカ政治ずっと見ていて、2016年の第1期トランプ政権の時の選挙をカバーしたりとか、あと、米中この貿易戦争をですね、本当デイ1からずっと初期からずっとカバーしている方で、ハノイのトランプ大統領とキム・ジョン委員長の会談とか、本当世界的なイベントをずっと追いかけている方なので、デレックさんが今のトランプ関税以降のですね、この世界経済の混乱、秩序の変化についてどう見ているのかということを聞いてみたいと思います。So, Derek Wallbank, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
So you're based in Singapore right now.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
How's Singapore?
You know, it's very warm, but it's a lovely place. You know, it's the epicenter of global trade flows in Asia for sure. It's a safe harbor city that's built its fortune on trade, and all of that is really kind of in play right now as we have this great power competition between China and the United States.
Right. I just introduced to our audience that you have been covering the U.S.-China trade war since day one.
Literally since day one. Yeah, in fact, I remember it was a cold January evening in Washington, D.C. when the very, very first tariffs, this is back in 2018, the very first tariffs that Donald Trump launched in his first presidency were put forward. I remember I was in the newsroom. There were very few of us who were there at the time. And the very first headline that crossed on that cold January day was on washing machines. Oh. So it started small, and it's gotten bigger from there. It was washing machines and then quickly followed by solar. So you can use that for any of your pub quizzes that may come forward. But no, it really has come from those small, humble origins all the way to being the dominant story that affects currencies and markets all over the world.
Right. It's becoming bigger and bigger. So today I want to cover three main topics. Number one is how Trump is shaping the global economy and the world order. And number two, what's Japan's role in all this? And for the final part, I'd like to discuss, are we seeing a power shift, especially China, the global south, and maybe we're witnessing a new balance of power. So let's start the interview. So for the first topic, you mentioned it started with washing machines. So Derek, how are you observing the current situations?
Well, I guess you could take that question in a number of different ways. I would say, as closely as possible, certainly, but you have to not be focused on one thing. You have to focus on a whole range of different things, because you can sit there and say that you're just going to see what the leaders and people with big titles want to do, but you really have to focus on the issue of trade and trade wars through the eyes of everyday people, shopkeepers who are trying to earn a living, people who are trying to buy groceries, people who are trying to buy presents for their children. Every single person has a stake in what's going on here, and actions that are taken by people in capitals with, as I say, with quite big jobs and responsibilities really do flow through the entire economy. So there is nobody who is exempt from this story.
So in Japan, what confuses me and all the other business leaders that it doesn't make sense. Tariffs doesn't make sense. But why is President Trump doing this, and how are the U.S. media reacting? What are your opinions?
Well, let me sort of back up there and talk through. You asked how Trump is looking at doing this. Let me give you an idea of where he sees this play coming from, and maybe that will help your viewers to kind of see. Maybe they can agree or they can disagree, but maybe get an idea of what he's thinking. So there has been a long-standing position in some corners of the U.S. economic circle that say that it would be a better situation if the U.S. produced more of what it consumes in America. Mm-hmm. It's a very big goal, and it's a very big problem, and you can come at that a number of different ways. one of the ideas is that if it is very difficult to produce things in the United States, one way you can incentivize that is not just by giving, subsidies and monetary handouts to people for doing things or tax breaks or whatever, but to actually penalize the idea of producing abroad and bringing in. The idea being it will be so expensive to do that from some foreign country and ship it over, and thus it will be less expensive to do it in America. Thus, you will incentivize, and so that's the fundamental idea. The second thing behind this is that tariffs are fundamentally a kind of tax, which means that they raise revenue. And so the U.S. right now has reasonably substantial budget deficits year on year, and so revenue raisers are somewhat attractive. And in the same way that you see countries around the world finding ways to tax people who do not live and vote there, the idea is that this is something that is a tax on something that you would rather disincentivize. Now, tariffs, of course, are paid by ultimately either the company that brings in something or the consumers who buy that product if that cost is passed on. So there is, a difficulty that this cost, whatever the increase in cost is, does flow through the economy.
Sure. So I get the fundamental idea that the U.S. needs to produce its own goods in its own country, and that makes sense. But it's so much obvious that in a global economy, U.S. also needs China, U.S. also needs Japan, U.S. also needs the rest of the world, and that's why the recent news that U.S. and China kind of reaching an agreement to reduce the tariffs. How are the U.S. media responding to all this? So fundamentally, we can all agree that it makes sense, but how to do it, it doesn't make sense for us.
Well, and look, let's just start with the agreement itself, right? The agreement there is a very temporary one. It's a 90-day agreement. The idea that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had said walking into those negotiations was that they wanted to see a de-escalation. There is a lot more work to do to solve anything in any reasonable, lasting way. So de-escalation is the word that I would say. This is kind of taking things back from a brink where U.S. officials said really the tariff levels they were at, 145% from the American side, 125% from the Chinese side, were both unsustainable and effectively a trade embargo. And so that was not where I think both sides wanted to be. They had gotten there because the U.S. had put on tariffs, and then China retaliated, and then the U.S. retaliated to that, and et cetera, until it built up to a point that it was quite vast. And so this is kind of taking the temperature down a little bit and searching for some conclusions. You have to, I think, go at this and say, if this is a temporary solution, you have to be mindful, all right, well, where are these negotiations going to go? What is going to get done in these negotiations? And look, sitting here at this point, just after this announcement has been made, it is perfectly fair to say that that the tariff levels are far lower than they just were. But at the same point, the tariff levels are higher than they were when Donald Trump took office. So it very much, even if this is bringing the temperature down, it is very clear that when you take the 10% global minimum tariff that Trump has placed across most U.S. trading partners, sectoral tariffs that have been implemented or promised among a range of industries, as well as reciprocal trading tariffs that many countries are trying to negotiate out of, not least of which Japan. It is very clear that as we stand right now, the tariff picture from the United States is far higher than it was when Trump took office, and projects to stay higher than it was when Trump took office, regardless of what deals happen to be cut going forward.
So in the Japanese media, we always talk about Bessent, and we want to know what the kind of person he is. So in the political circle, in the U.S. political circle, what are people talking about? How's he rated?
Well, Scott Bessent is interesting, and I'm glad you asked in the political circle, because it's a great framing by which to think of this. Scott Bessent is not thought of as someone who is a political person. And by that, I mean, he did not come up through politics in the same way that Marco Rubio did, right? Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was a senator from the state of Florida. He's a longtime political actor in the Republican Party. Scott Bessent comes out of the business world, which is a little bit of a different kind of thing. It's not that he doesn't have his own political opinions or has had them for years or, all of that. He certainly has. But he's not someone who made his mark in politics. He's someone who made his mark in business. And Scott Bessent is there to be somebody who is a business person, who understands business, who understands how to bridge some of the things that Donald Trump wants to do, that some of his political base want to do, with the business reality that this is a president who for 4 years in his first term said, whether you like me or you don't like me, look at your retirement plan, look at your investments, and see how they're going up, and that will be okay. This term so far, he has not had the reaction in the markets to be able to say that. Instead, the White House has been forced into a framing of saying that, don't worry about where things are now. It will get better. They have sought to reduce any fault they may have for current market conditions, saying that this is part of the economy they inherited. There is significant debate about that question, let's be clear. But that's not sort of the all things positive framing that the Trump administration certainly tried to use in the first term. So Bessent is somebody whose job is in part to kind of figure out a way to get to where Trump wants to go.
So do you think Scott Bessent is a person who can kind of stop Trump so he won't go into the wrong direction?
I wouldn't say that. I would say Scott Bessent is someone who right now enjoys the confidence of the president. He is somebody that Trump put in place there to do a specific job, and Trump has said he's going out and doing that. So I wouldn't say this is like the first term when you had people who said, I'm going to check the president. That is not something we're hearing from his appointees in this administration.
I see. Scott Bessent is not only a business person, but also a historian. He taught in Yale, and I've read his speeches, and he seems to be critical on the Bretton Woods system, which is a world international system since 1944. How serious he is to change the world order of economics?
Well, I think the thing that I would say there is that every single person in the Trump administration, fundamentally, their job is to implement the Trump administration vision. And this is a presidency where that is particularly true. You would say that of all presidents, but this White House specifically. This is a White House with a decider-in-chief on top of it, and other folks who are meant, if I can use a sort of aquatic analogy, everyone's rowing the same boat in the same direction. So whatever somebody brings into it, you are doing what the president, kind of wants. You're going in the direction that he wants to go there. But look, make no mistake, Donald Trump and his allies and the people who voted him into office would say that the fundamental way that the world economy has been ordered has not been one that has been fair to the United States. The trade secretary, the trade representative, Jameson Greer, was saying just the other day, after this China deal was announced, that for years and years, the World Trade Organization has been a place to sort of govern the rules of trade and how things are going, and that the U.S. has tried to work through those avenues and it hasn't worked. And so this is a different way of going. I do think at a fundamental level that the president has been very clear that he sees the fundamental trade systems that are going forward as needing to be changed. We talked about wanting to bring back that manufacturing, bring back a lot of production to the United States. And this is somebody who has made no secret of the fact that he thinks that the U.S. has been treated unfairly and wants to change that. Again, you can think that that's right or wrong, but that is the framework by which he's coming into that conversation.
Right. So having that said, let's talk about Japan. What's Japan's role in all this? Do you think Japan can do something, contribute to the world?
I mean, I think the Japanese contributions to the world on a broad scale, I mean, are ones that go without mention. But Japan occupies a really interesting place in this president's imagination. You know, I know that people in Japan are very aware of the relationship that Trump and Shinzo Abe had, for example, and that has continued through in Trump's second administration with the current administration in Japan. You know, this is a country that the U.S. looks at strategically as one that could play a bigger role on the world stage. I do think that there is an admiration for a lot that Japan has been able to do with its economy, even if sometimes that expresses as frustration that Japan has done very, very well in certain things, and that the U.S. would like to see its own products more in the streets of Tokyo and elsewhere. You know, Trump often talks about you look in Tokyo and you don't see many American cars. There is a certain want to change that, right? But I think when you look through economically, the U.S. wants Japan to be a major player. The U.S. would love additional Japanese investment into the United States. They'd love additional production facilities in the United States. You see Japanese business leaders able to work with the U.S., work with the Trump administration to some degrees. And so you're seeing a level of closeness there. And when we think through major international, defense cooperation, the Quad, for example, Japan is a huge part there. And the U.S. has been one of the nations, and I think this is bipartisan, but cheerleading the idea that Japan should do more on the world stage. And certainly I think that's something that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden both very much agreed with.
So Japan has seen negotiations, US, UK, US, China, and we have to continue our negotiations with the United States. So let's say you were like an advisor to the Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru. What would you advise him?
Well, I can't say that he has my cell phone number, and I can certainly, though, tell you that he hasn't used it. So, so this would be very, very hypothetical. I mean, he's welcome to. I'm easy to find.
I'll tell him.
But no, I would say this in all sincerity. Japan starts from an interesting position in any negotiation. Look, the U.S. has said that doing a deal with Japan is a little bit more complicated, but the fact that Donald Trump showed up personally to negotiations with Japanese trade delegations speaks volumes, because he only has 24 hours in a day. So where he spends his time is probably his most valuable resource. That joining of the negotiations should signal how important the White House feels it is to get a deal with Japan. Now, if it is coming in third or fourth or fifth or seventh or 12th, who knows? Who can say? We're not in the room for those negotiations. But it's clear that Japan is a priority for the president. I do think that one thing every country is doing, and I'm talking to a lot of diplomats here in Singapore, which, as I said, is a big trade hub. One thing I hear across the board is that everyone was waiting for deal number one to see how it would be struck and what the contours would be. And then they were all taking lessons off of that. So Japan will no doubt be looking at the United Kingdom deal. They will be looking to see what was agreed there and seeing if there are paths forward that can help in their own negotiation. I do think that would be something that's going on right now.
So the Japanese people are worried about cars because it's a major topic in these negotiations. And when I interview economists and some people in the automobile industry, we know that President Trump wants to see more U.S. cars in the Japanese market, but simply put it, maybe Japanese cars are better than the U.S. cars. So no offense, but so do you think the negotiation among automobile will reach kind of a deal in the future, or do you think, what's your predictions?
Well, I'm not really in the business of making predictions, but what I will say is that a consumer's decision and the market barriers to entry are sometimes different things. And so if Japan can convince the president that that U.S. automobiles will have a fair shot compared to other imported vehicles, perhaps that would be a place that they can go. I mean, I think Trump has some ideas about what Japanese barriers happen to be. He certainly said those things quite a lot. And that's going to be something that Japan will need to address, and will be thinking about how it's going to address there. But I do think, when you look at the British deal, for example, that was a framework. It wasn't a sort of product that would have had 10 years spent on it, right? It's not down to every single, as we say in the US, I being dotted and T being crossed, meaning you haven't gone down to every single subsection of text and worked out the exact ways that things are going to be done. It was very much a kind of top line deal. So what we're looking at here is a kind of top line deal, ensuring market access, ensuring what the Trump administration would see as market fairness. But there is a partner that has suggested that it's open to making these sorts of deals. The U.S. has said very clearly, the Trump administration has said repeatedly, that Japan is high on the list and top of the list of nations that it wants to get a deal with. And so, that would all be kind of positive. And the idea that you're seeing a UK trade deal, the idea that you've seen a de-escalation on China, and we're still kind of early in that 90-day window for negotiations, all of that seems to be kind of positive if you are Japan.
Great. So we have to wrap up. So we'll go on to the final part of the discussion. So are we seeing a power shift? Because so after maybe 4 years, what will the world look like? Do you think US will still be the world superpower, or do you think China or other global South countries will rise up during this situation?
I don't necessarily see it as a zero-sum kind of thing. The U.S. is going to be a powerful force, certainly a powerful economic and military force going forward. But the U.S. is trying to figure out where it wants to be in the global world standing as well. Some parts of being the only major superpower mean that you have responsibilities that a lot of U.S. voters may look on with some amount of skepticism. You've seen that in terms of foreign aid. You've seen that in terms of foreign defense commitments and entanglements. And some of those wind up being, in some ways, politically unpopular sometimes, certainly less popular than they were 20, 30 years ago. So there has been a shift in terms of the American side, still wanting to be a superpower, but trying to kind of redefine where that is. I would also say after the first Trump administration, a lot of things he did, including some tariffs on China, were not immediately reversed by a new president from a different party. So some of this happens to be bipartisan. There is certainly room for other nations to rise, though. And I think that part of the U.S. strategy in the Pacific certainly envisions India rising, certainly envisions Japan rising, and Australia rising as well. China is on its own trajectory. Everything, I think most people agree that China's trajectory is upward. At the same time, as I say, India's trajectory is upward. There are other nations that have a chance to rise themselves, and the world looks a lot more multipolar over maybe the next 20 years than it did over the prior 20 years. That's not necessarily bad. That's just the world as it evolves. And bringing more people out of poverty into situations where they can have food security and the chance to change their stars and dream new dreams is certainly, probably, you would say, a pretty good positive for the world overall. So I do think that the world looks different as we're going forward. Certainly it looks different. There are opportunities for a lot of countries. The U.S. will still be there, though. Reports of its death have been greatly exaggerated. And I think one thing you would see from both administrations, Republicans and Democrats, is that the idea of betting against the United States is a very risky bet indeed.
How about Japan in 4 years?
Oh, it's hard to say in 4 years. I think overall, though, the U.S. is very much hoping that Japan will be a major player on the world stage. There are, Japan has its own internal debates that it will have about what role it wants to take. Certainly militarily and security-wise, it will have those debates. Economically, Japan has an awful lot going for it economically. At the same time, it's got a lot of the challenges that many other major first world economies have in terms of workforce and birth rates and work-life balances and all sorts of other things that a lot of places are dealing with. And so, it will have its own challenges to work out, but it is hard to see a scenario in which the story of this part of the world is written without Japan being an absolutely critical central part to it. And as I say, I think that's just as the United States wants it to be. The U.S. strategy very much envisions Japan as a major player for a long time going forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Derek-san. Thank you for your insights and your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
はい、ワールドデコーダー以上となります。ぜひチャンネル登録の方もよろしくお願いします。